was a rainy night in Granby, not 4 or 5 miles from here, when Kara Rintala ran across her yard to her neighbor's house to tell him that she had found Anne Marie Rintala's body in the basement. But when Roy Dupuis, the neighbor, called 911, he had difficulty conveying the situation. It's her, he stammered and he hesitated. They're married, he blurted out. The 911 operator responded, probably a domestic, meaning domestic violence, and told the responding officers, there's a male in the basement of the house. Of course, there was no male in the basement of the house. Lying on the floor was Anne Marie Rintala, Kara Rintala's wife. I can't believe she's dead, Kara said as the police officers came down the basement stairs. And after they had eased Anne Marie's body off of Kara's lap and taken her upstairs, she said, we've been arguing since yesterday. We should never leave each other mad. And then, after a time, she said, I understand I'm the #1 suspect. That was March 29th, 2010. In October 2011, Kara Rintala was arrested on the charge of first-degree murder, and thus began the first same-sex marital homicide case in the nation. It's a remarkable time for same-sex marriage, isn't it? I mean, it seems as though state after state is beginning to authorize it, and more people, including conservatives, are endorsing it. And that is really something to celebrate, as marriage advocates suggest. After all, not only do same-sex couples elevate themselves into the symbolic world of the normal through marriage, but a number of very important practical benefits flow from being married: hospitalization, visitation rights, and inheritance, and tax benefits, and the like. So it really is something, a cause to celebrate. Legally, the argument in favor of same-sex marriage depends upon the claim that we are the same as you. That is to say, in the Aristotelian logic of the law, likes ought to be treated alike. We fall in love, we buy houses, we have children, we make plans, and so therefore it's unjust to discriminate against us. Now, not every court in every state has taken up that argument, but it has gained a lot of energy. There's a lot of momentum behind that argument. It does beg certain interesting questions, though. One might ask, are we the same? Maybe a more refined way to put that is, in what ways are we the same? And should we want to be the same? And this is where the Rintala trial comes in for me, because it offers a specific provocation, a challenge to this assimilationist same-sex argument that you can see being made all across the nation. It's always informative. You can learn something about the nature and demands of marriage by looking at an unusual one that falls apart. And the rich texture of a murder trial can help us to see some of the differences that might be there between straight and gay marriages. And if we can't ask about the differences, then we can't ask ourselves whether there are any costs in trying to be and make everyone the same. Now, I want to start with an early moment in the three-week trial I sat in on. Kara Rintala sat at the defense table and watched herself in a videotape being interviewed by a police officer the night Anne Marie was murdered. From my vantage point, it looked like this haunting, uncanny image, the videotape Kara hovering over the courtroom Kara as though one were talking to the other. As in the videotape, Kara was responding to only 1 or 2 questions. She looked disheveled, she looked a little dissociative, and she launched into a 2-hour monologue, about the conflicted nature of her relationship with Anne Marie Rintala. Almost the first thing she said, I didn't want to get married. They were too different, she said. They came from different backgrounds. Their child created too many stresses in the household. Anne Marie spent too much money. She took Kara's own money. She bullied her in her own house. But Kara had come from a family that had gone through a divorce, and she wanted to keep her family together at all costs. But still, she said, we pushed each other. And then I love her in the present tense. And then I chose to marry her. But she said, I feel like my head could fall off. Now, you might wonder why Kara would marry Anne-Marie after describing this kind of conflictual situation. But then again, you might not. After all, at the present political moment, it seems almost like common sense that most people in the gay and lesbian community would embrace marriage as the apex of a successful relationship. After all, it would be churlish to refuse after all the advocacy, all the legal battles, all the political will, all the victories. There's almost an imperative to marriage. If you step back and take a longer view, though, it appears that marriage is actually a relatively recent priority for the gay and lesbian rights movement. If you go back to the 1970s and 80s, the gay and lesbian liberation movements were, if anything, much more decidedly anti than pro-marriage. Marriage was seen as stultifying, even subordinating. Marriage was traditional, conventional. Marriage was square. Marriage was patriarchal. So it's worth asking, well, what's happened? What's changed? George Chauncey, in his book, he's a historian, Why Marriage, offers us two explanations: HIV/AIDS and new reproductive technologies. During the 1980s and 90s, the vulnerability that gay men felt as they fell ill and died from HIV/AIDS galvanized protests against unsympathetic hospitals and landlords and insurance companies and families of origin. And in those protests, gay men claimed the rights that married heterosexual couples took for granted. At the same time, the so-called lesbian baby boom developed out of new reproductive technologies that separated pregnancy from heterosexual sex. And in the effort to protect their children and ensure their children's well-being, those couples also demanded the rights that emerged from family law and marriage law. So these two movements kind of came into confluence and made gay marriage the priority, political priority in the gay rights movement. Now, doing so, they marginalized some other things that were also important priorities: the demand for the end of employment discrimination, for example, or the liberation of sexuality from traditional arrangements. In other words, marriage became the holy grail of the gay rights movement. Now, so you might see then why Kara and Anne-Marie would marry in spite of the fact of all of their conflict. And in fact, beyond that, in order to complete the family romance, they adopted a child. So from the point of view of this kind of abstract heterosexual marriage template, it seemed to fit pretty well. But as I was sitting in the courtroom, I began to feel some friction with this template that became more and more palpable as the trial went on. Now, it wasn't as though anybody was making a big deal out of the same-sex marriage issue. I mean, after all, right, we live here. And living here, this is probably the most accepting place in the nation for same-sex marriage. So it wasn't that. It was more in the little things that cropped up over the course of the trial. For example, in the beginning, both attorneys called Anne-Marie and Kara Ms. Rintala, which created a certain amount of confusion in the courtroom, as you can imagine. So they resorted to the expedient of using first names, which not only overturned courtroom convention, but intensified the intimacy of the stories they told in court. More than that, probably more significantly, the word wife became an important motif. It was bandied around over and over again. Anne-Marie and Kara were wives. There was testimony calling each other wives, and the like. It became something really overdetermined, almost as though there was some really important ethical obligation that the lawyers wanted to place before the jury to be sure they understood the stakes in the case. That raised an interesting question in my mind, which is, what does it mean for a wife to be accused of murdering a wife. Over the course of the trial, it became clear that no one exactly knew. Historically speaking, of course, wife only takes on meaning in relation to the word husband. Under the laws of coverture, which existed in the United States through the mid to late 19th century and carried on in customs, when a man and a woman married, they became one, as Sir William Blackstone said, and that one was man. In other words, when women married, they gave up their independence as legal entities in and of themselves. What that meant in practice was that women couldn't hold property, women couldn't make enforceable contracts, women couldn't live where they wanted, they couldn't deny their husband's sex. They really had no independent legal identity. They were treated like children as dependents, and as such, they were supposed to be submissive. Now, of course, we think of those as quaint and antiquated gender norms, and we think of ourselves in the contemporary United States as rather distanced from that. But if you look around, you can still see vestiges of it. After all, many women take their husbands' names when they marry. In many marriages, fathers give their daughters away to their husbands. Women earn less money. Women tend to do more childcare. And women suffer domestic violence much, much less. So as much as we'd like to say that these old gender norms are past, they actually become cultural touchstones that inform in some way still the way we understand heterosexual marriage. Now, attorneys love to grab onto these kinds of norms in order to build stories for the jury that can make it seem like there's a kind of cultural common sense that ought to lead them to one kind of conclusion or another. And scholars have written volumes about the way attorneys would do that. In the Rintala case, though, that was problematic. It was very difficult to impose this norm of wife on this couple. Kara didn't seem like a wife at all. I mean, she was conjured as the responsible one, the one who paid all the bills, the one who covered Anne-Marie's lavish spending. Anne-Marie, on the other hand, was conjured as the irresponsible one, the one who was profligate and promiscuous and volatile. She got involved in emotional and romantic relationships with other men and women. She was the one that wanted the fancy minivan. She was the one that wanted the expensive jewelry. She was the one that bullied Kara over and over again via text the night before she died. So these roles didn't seem to fit the Rintala family very well. Well, what other stories could attorneys draw on in order to make their case in court? There was violence between these two women, and battering stories are very powerful in court. Remember the O.J. Simpson trial, the way that there was a contest over whether or not evidence of O.J. Simpson's battering, past acts of battering against his wife Nicole ought to be allowed into court. The prosecutor in that case wanted to make the argument that an aggressive husband threatened and abused his wife in ways that would inevitably lead to murder. Again, though, in this case, that was a difficult narrative to make out. It was difficult to cast Kara as the abusive husband whose violence would crescendo into murder. And it was difficult to cast Anne-Marie as the submissive and downtrodden spouse. So in other words, the words wife were bandied around in court, but neither one of them was particularly wifely. The template just didn't fit. Now, after the last time that Kara and Anne-Marie found themselves at the police station, after having another time literally raced to the police station to see who could get there first to file charges of battering against the other. And after the last time they were at the police station, they were hauled before a family court judge in Belchertown. And that judge threatened to take their child away. He chided them like children. He said, "I'll call DCS right now. Is that what you want? If one of you wants to make an allegation of abuse, you'd better have documentation. I'll be on the phone so fast, they'll be here before you get out the door." The district attorney suggested that it was that threat, the threat of losing her child to either Anne Marie or the state, that pushed Kara Rintala over the edge. Now, maybe given cultural expectations we have about what it means to be a mother, there is a particular intensity to mothering in lesbian families. Maybe that intensity turned pathological for Kara and, as the district attorney suggested, caused her to snap, flip, and to strangle Anne Marie Rintala in a rage so vicious that warranted first-degree murder charges. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Kara Rintala could have done something like that. It's not impossible to imagine two wives in constant conflict, exhausted, broke, jealous, and the child becomes the linchpin, the unwitting catalyst for murder. That's a different kind of story to tell, isn't it? Can the heterosexual template for marriage account for that kind of intensity between two wives, two mothers? I think the very act of asking that question suggests that the Rintala trial puts pressure on and challenges this assimilationist argument that gay and lesbian couples are the same as heterosexual couples. Now, ultimately, in the end of the trial, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury hung. Why? We'll never know for sure. Juries don't have to tell us why they decide the way they do. I wondered, though, whether this misfit between the template, this heterosexual template we've been talking about, and the actualities of the Rintala murder trial may have contributed to the indeterminacy of that outcome. We don't know for sure, of course, but what we can say, what we do know, is that the structure of marriage, the language of marriage, its expectations and betrayals framed this case. The defense also suggested that they framed Kara Rintala. From the minute the police got that 911 call, they expected to see a heterosexual battering situation, which led them to assume spousal murder, which led them, the defense said, to overlook important evidence in the case. Now, be that as it may, what can we say about the actualities of Kara Rintala? I mean, the attorneys, it's no wonder they tried to conjure her in one way or another in the final analysis. And what was she conjured as? She was conjured as both the responsible one, the most reliable one, the most monogamous partner on the one hand, and the most stable and loving mother on the other. Husband and wife, both and none. Who was this person? And wanting the perfect marriage, did she snap? To ask that question is not to suggest that Kara Rintala actually committed first-degree murder. It is instead to ask the question, what is marriage in all its glorious and destructive power? And if there is a destructive power in marriage, how do we understand its costs? This is the question, I think, that marriage advocates have left behind. If we just tried to describe their marriage rather than to correct it, what would we see? We'd see an impossible injunction to monogamy. We'd see a legal obligation to cover another's enormous debt. We'd see a family court that threatens to harm a family rather than to help it. So how then ought we understand marriage? Marriage, it turns out to be, is something that's plays itself out in a very ambiguous way. And perhaps we need to ask and understand what the costs of marriage were. Instead of understanding Kara Rintala to have failed at marriage, we might ask, why do we funnel all of these pressures through the mechanism of marriage? Why? Let's ask the question. Why monogamy? Why shared obligation for debt? Why a two-parent family? Why, more generally, make marriage the prerequisite for all of the benefits that we all like to like to enjoy. Now, and if it may be that there are reasons enough to justify organizing heterosexual families this way, do those reasons equally apply in same-sex families? Should we want all marriages to be treated the same? I think we can organize ourselves differently, in different ways, and still retain a solid social fabric, drawing on what's best in a variety of families rather than elevating one kind of model above all the others. So suppose, just suppose, a state expanded the definition of family to include more than two parents. Could that have taken away the weapon, the threat of losing her child, that may have pushed Cara Rintala over the edge into murder? That is the kind of question that the Rintala trial posed for me. And that ultimately is the challenge that I think the legal recognition of same-sex relationships ought to pose for all of us.
In the morning, in the backyard, a chair to wonder how life got so small. Could this be all there is? Through the screen door, cups and saucers, chirping like birds, well, she'll be okay. I can get away for a while. 'Cause something's gnawing, it's always nagging. I gotta do something before it's too late.